Okay, I want to tell a story about what is known by some people as the Creek Indian Pocahontas. Her name is Millie Francis, and she received a congressional medal for what she did. The story I'm going to read tonight is from the journal of Richard Keith Call, who was the Florida territorial governor during the Second Seminole War. And if I can get the screen share working here. Uh, this is Richard Keith Call. He was a lieutenant and then captain in the U.S. Army. He started out in the Tennessee militia, and he was a prodigy of Andrew Jackson, and that's his wife Mary next to him. She absolutely hated Jackson, and she's one of the few people that held a gun to Jackson and lived to tell about it there. But they were married in the Hermitage. Call started his military career about 1809, joined the Tennessee militia. Later on, he was incorporated into the regular army. I think he was in the 44th Infantry. Uh, he was at the Battle of New Orleans. He was in much of the Creek War. He was not at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And then, like the other first few governors of Florida, he was, as I mentioned, a protege of Jackson, as William Duval and John Eaton were also that way. But he developed some political differences and really didn't like some of the things Jackson said, and he'll mention it. I'll read to you. But anyway, he ended up giving the eulogy at Jackson's funeral in 1845. And here's a picture of Richard Keith Call as governor. This is Richard Keith Call as governor. And I believe he was, he was born in, I think in, was it 1790 or 1792? Anyway, um, he died in 1862 in his mansion, Orchard Pond. He has a mansion in Tallahassee that you can view today. It's called the Grove, and it's a famous site. And when the pandemic's over and it opens up for tours again, you can see it. But it has a YouTube channel or I think a Facebook page, and the Facebook page has several videos that they put on during the pandemic, and you can see more about Call and the gardens and Leroy Collins, another governor who lived there who had married Call's granddaughter. And so Millie Francis, who she was, we'd have to mention her father. This is her father, Josiah Francis, also called Hillis Hadjo. He had a Creek mother, and a French officer at Fort Duluth was his father. And he was considered the medicine man or a prophet, and was one of the people that incited the Creeks, the Red Stick Creeks during the Creek War in 1813 and 1814. And so Jackson was gunning to him and wanted to get him. And it took Jackson about 5 years till he finally captured him and hung him at Fort St. Mark's. Fort St. Mark's is about 30 miles south of Tallahassee, near the Gulf Coast. You can see a picture behind me, the virtual screen. It's a historic site as it looks today, ruins of the Spanish walls. The Spanish built the fort in 1780, oh, I'm sorry, earlier, 1680. So it's about the second oldest fort in Florida. And it was used to guard the entrance where the confluence of the St. Marks and the Wacola River were, that ships would go into a place called Spanish Hold in Appalachia Bay, and the big ships would stay there, and barges or smaller boats that could get over the shallows of the river, bring stuff down and load and unload from the ships. And the fort was guarding the entrance to the river because Mission San Luis and other historic site around Tallahassee that you can visit. The Spanish were growing a lot of food that they were shipping to other Spanish settlements in Florida and maybe down into Mexico too, since it's on the Gulf Coast. It trades quite a lot. It was attacked by pirates and taken over by pirates. It had sordid history. Uh, it was hit by a hurricane and drowned the garrison one time. So it was a isolated post out on the frontier, and you'd have a rough life. Anyway, back to Josiah Francis. He had a daughter. Her name was Millie Francis. And what happened is Jackson's soldiers came down about 1818, and one of the soldiers, Duncan McCrimmon, goes fishing and he wanders off, and he's captured by Creek warriors. And Josiah Francis's village was only a few miles away from Fort St. Mark's, and they captured him and were going to kill him. It shows here that they're burning him to the stake. They are probably going to shoot him instead, and they had stripped him down. But anyway, Millie Francis, she was just a young girl about that time, 13 or 15. No much older than that, about 15, I guess. But she sees that they're going to burn him and burn him alive or shoot him or kill him. So she pleads to her father, Josiah Francis, says, spare him. He's just a young man. He's not really a warrior. And the father says, well, I can't do anything about it. It's up to those warriors. They're taking vengeance for one of their relatives who was killed. And so she goes up to him and very eloquently speaks and saying, this young man is not a full warrior there. He's just a boy. Killing him will not bring back your dead sister or your relative, whoever they are taking vengeance for. And so they are persuaded by her speech. And they said on the one condition he would have to join the Creeks, join them, which he agreed to do. And he stayed with them for a while until the Indians sold him to the Spanish at Fort St. Mark's sometime later. Anyway, because of Millie's bravery, it said that Duncan McCrimmon offered to marry her, and when she was during removal, but she said no, she was not doing it out of love. She was only doing it out of humanity and uh, just in her better nature. She said she is hoping it's something anyone would do. And so, anyway, there was two men trading with the Indians. They're British. After the War of 1812, the English dropped off many British officers in the Bahamas. There's one man named Alexander Arbuthnot, and he was trying to set up a trading company to compete with the trading monopoly out of Pensacola, the Pant and Leslie store, and they had a store here at Fort St. Mark's. And there was another man who was employed by him named Robert Ambrister. And so Jackson took Fort St. Mark's and he captured Arbuthnot, and who was at the fort. In Ambrister, he had captured when he went over to Old Town to attack Old Town. And Jackson had a military tribunal held inside the fort. And this is a picture of him trying Robert Ambrister. Ambrister was a young Marine. His employer, Alexander Arbuthnot, was 70 years old. So anyway, the judgment comes, of course, to execute him. They wanted to just flog Ambrister, but Jackson said that's not good enough, forced them to shoot him. So he was shot. Now the story goes is that he was having a romance with Millie Francis there. And so Jackson captured and hanged Josiah Francis, and then he executed Arbuthnot and Ambrister, and within the same day probably. And so Millie, in one day, she lost her father and her friend there. And so the story takes place about her visiting the grave here at Fort St. Mark's. Now, just to put an end to the story, the story about Millie Francis saving Duncan McCrimmon made all the newspapers in the country, and she became famous. And effort was pushed, partly with the help of Ethan Allen Hitchcock, a famous Army officer. I think he was famous at the Battle of Gettysburg, but he was, I think, a lieutenant colonel maybe at the time. And so he pushed that uh, she got a medal. And so Congress issued Millie Francis a congressional medal. She is the first woman to ever receive much. This is the Treasury uh, warrant, I guess, to pay for a medal to be struck, $8.50, which was a lot of money back then. That was like a month's pay for most people. And at the same time, Congress also gave to her a pension. And this is a copy of the check for her pension, $451.35, paid to Millie, an Indian woman. So that's pretty cool. So Ethan Allen Hitchcock, he took the medal and the pension and went out to Oklahoma to find her. And he found her, he did, and to give her the medal and the pension payment. But unfortunately, she died just a short time, maybe an hour or two before he arrived. So it was a really sad tragedy, but man, what a story it is. So here's Richard Keefe Call, what he wrote about Millie Francis. Now, her name is also Mallee or Mallee, Mallee, and Call writes that in his journal. So maybe that's why people didn't see that. So the events taking place here, it says 1823 was in the journal. Richard Keefe Call, he was part of the party to locate a new capital for Florida, which ended up being Tallahassee. So he went with Dr. Simmons and John Lee Williams, and they landed at St. Mark's and were looking around. This is 1823. So this is, I'll start the journal from there. They're at St. Mark's and they meet a few Indians that are in the area. One is called Swamp John. And so Richard Keefe Calls talking to Swamp John. It says Spanish and Indians told me many interesting things of his people and country. They preferred the Spanish to occupy the country because they stayed in their forts and gave them the land. The British's and the United States peoples too hard on Indians. Indian no afraid, but old Jack, from which I understood the Indians are only afraid of General Jackson. In a half comic, half tragic manner, he described General Jackson's rapid march through the country. He said it was like a mad hawk. He came down to the fort, drove the Spaniards out, and sent them to Pensacola in two little vessels. And that's actually true because that's in the congressional papers when Jackson took over the fort during the First Seminole War in March 1818. He put the Spanish in two boats and sent them to Pensacola. And just as one poor Britisher go jump on he horse, he tell him stay, no go. What no go? Old Jack say no go, cause you make Indian bad. And I guess that strange vernacular is Swamp John talking. So I asked my companion if the Britisher's name was Arbuthnot. He answered yes, adding Captain, which he continued to call him. Then he described General Jackson, his progress 60 miles east to River Swanee, or more progress San Juanee or Little St. John's. The Swanee River at that time and earlier was also called St. John's or San Juan in some of the accounts, but that's the Swanee River where Jackson went to attack Old Town. How the Indians all scattered before him, and how he caught two more Britishers and brought them back to Fort St. Mark's, because they make Indian bad too. And with the motion as if shooting an arrow, he illustrated the haste with which the two were judged and condemned to die, and by his frequent ejaculation of damn, damn, He expressed the indignation of the Indians at the treatment of these men received, whom my former knowledge of the circumstances I knew to be Arbuthnot and Ambrister, two licensed traders who unfortunately incurred the jealousy of speculating adventurers from the United States who were rivals in the profits of the Indian custom and whose malicious reports prejudiced in the mind of General Jackson, which led him to pursue a course towards them that shocked and astounded the civilized world. Talking about the execution of these British and Spanish territory, the insufficiency of the evidence to condemn, and the haste to execute foreigners pursuing their legitimate trade on foreign soil among foreigners, question the justice of the court and the mercy of the general who decided their fate. But the favor of the people can do no wrong, and he has so far gone unscathed. In my return to the fort, I asked my Indian friend, show me the graves of these white men. Leading the way over the bridge that stretches across the ditch at the back of the fort, he conducted me to a spot 100 yards more or less distant, where at the foot of a towering pine, he pointed out two graves side by side. 6 years of vegetation had covered their beds with tangled mass of shrubs and vines, so that it was difficult to identify them. But I realized a pious pleasure in removing the ugliest debris and rites, trimming the shrubs and vines so as to form a canopy of natural verdure over the last resting place of these unfortunate men, and leaving them to the mild music of the birds and the sighing reeds. I turned away sadly, meditating upon man's inhumanity to man, set forth in the murder of these men, one with life's dreams all before him, the other 70. Swamp John, as we walked, told me that for a long time after these men were buried here, an Indian girl by the name of Mallee or Millie came every moon and laid down on the grave of the young man and made so much sorry that she could be heard all around, that she was a young man's girl, that she was pretty like Spanish squaw, rode a fine horse and dressed like senorita, and that she went to the grave where Ambrister was shot and stood near him as near him as possible and made much loud and dead too, and then take away, which I interpreted to mean that the savage girl felt as other true maidens would feel under like circumstance, and that overcame with grief she fainted and was carried away by her friends. My companion told me further that Mallee was the daughter of the chief named Francis, whose town was 3 miles towards the west, that he was a big warrior, take much scalps, and owns several hundred Negroes, and owned much land and horses and cattle, that General Jackson's mans caught him on board a ship and hung him only a short time before the execution of Arbuthnot and Ambrister. Consequently, poor Mallee lost both father and lover by this extraordinary invasion. To my inquiry of Mallee, he answered sullenly, go away, pointing to the east, and fell into the gloomy river, saddened by all the sorrow reminiscences my curiosity had aroused. And that's Richard Keefe Call's journal and his account. He calls Millie Francis a savage and uses the S word, but she is no savage at all, because you can see from his writing, she rode a very beautiful horse. She dressed as a fancy senorita. She was royalty, and you can tell Richard Keefe Call the indignation and the anger that he held towards his former general at what he had done, killing those British men, and what Millie endured, her sorrow. So that's an interesting account that I haven't really heard much anywhere else. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this story, listening to a little known story about Millie Francis. And I'll leave it there. And oh, one more thing is that I translated this account from Richard Keith Call's journal. His handwriting's hard to read. Uh, it was reprinted by his daughter in the newspaper, Ellen Call Long, printed in the newspaper in the 1890s, but she changed some of the things. Instead of a tall pine tree, she said a palm tree, and changing the Francis's village on the Wakulla River. She said the Ochlockonee River, which totally different location. Details like that. So I looked in the Florida Memory. They have Call's papers, and they have this on there in his journal. And the WPA transcribed it. So I looked at the WPA and what Richard Keith Call wrote and what Ellen Call Long wrote, and I tried to do a true transcription of what Richard Keith Call wrote in his journal. So I hope I gave it to you. And y'all have a good evening, good day, whatever time you're listening to that.